So welcome everyone to the Blavatnik School of Government for this panel discussion on the U.S. and the world with Thomas Hale, Christoph Pelk, Yeling Tan, and Philippa Webb. I'm Pepper Culpepper. I'm the Blavatnik Professor of Government and Public Policy here at the school. And we're delighted to have those in the room and those online for a discussion. And our goal today is to try to make sense of what may seem to many of you a very chaotic and changing picture. And it seems that way to us too, members of the panel. But we have expertise in particular areas, and we're going to use that to try to start a conversation about what we can expect from the next week and maybe from the next 4 years from the new incoming administration. And I'm going to introduce each of our panelists as they speak, and we'll start out with Philippa Webb, who is a professor of public international law here at the Blavatnik School and a fellow of Exeter College. And she works on international dispute settlement and human rights, including fair trials, free speech, and the prohibition of genocide and modern slavery. Philippa, we've heard that Greenland might be changing hands. So we're in a world suddenly where we might wonder if international law has purchase. How do we think about what's happening with the entry of the new Trump administration, and how would you think about the changes we're likely to see in the international order?
Thanks, Pepper. So it's early days, but we also had a bit of a preview during the first Trump administration, which he also brought up Greenland, but it got less traction. And what I'm seeing are three potential roles emerging for the United States in this second Trump administration. The first and most obvious one is the role of an aggressor, a bully, and that's where Greenland comes in, potential military threats against the Panama Canal, economic coercion threats to Canada. We then have another role, and these roles are not mutually exclusive and they overlap and are in tension with each other, where Trump calls himself a peacemaker, but really I think it's better to think of him as a deal maker. This is a transactional approach of a real estate developer to some of these big international law issues. And this pertains to his attitude towards Ukraine, towards Israel and Gaza. And then finally, when it comes to international institutions, we have the role of the US as a reformer or a disruptor. So one of the executive orders passed today withdraws the US from the World Health Organization. That will take effect in 12 months. And there's also, previous to Trump, but anticipating him, there's a bill that will be going before the Senate that will impose sanctions on the ICC and its supporters who are foreign persons. And just to your question of how should we approach this, I think for a long time in international law, we've talked about the art of the possible. How can we be creative within the framework of international law? I think we need to reset our expectations with the US, and we need to realize this is the art of the deal. It's going to be transactional. We need to start thinking in terms of how these transactions can take place in a way that doesn't destroy the international legal order. And I think, maybe we can come to this later, I think there are opportunities there. It's interesting already to see the narrative with Greenland, that at first we were all outraged. This can't happen. Military forces, of course, off the table. But now the Greenlanders are starting to say, well, we were always interested in independence and we care about our self-determination, and we may actually be open for business with particular states or companies. So I think there is a transactional element that's coming through really strongly now, but that doesn't mean it all has to be doom and gloom.
So we were a few years ago talking about the importance of international law and the sanctity of borders, and the U.S. was claiming, the United States was claiming that was a very important principle. And now that principle seems suddenly to be up for grabs. Now, how do we think about the change in position of the most powerful actor in the international system vis-a-vis international law, and are international lawyers concerned?
I think international lawyers are really concerned, but the question is, what do we do with that concern? Do we say that, oh, that means we're now reassessing these international rules that have been sort of at the core of our legal order for so many decades or centuries? Or does it mean that we push back? And what I've seen around the dialogue around the Panama Canal, the dialogue around Greenland, is that international lawyers and international leaders that respect international law are saying military force is completely off the table. That would be a violation of the UN Charter, and that will have serious consequences. But they're also thinking about, well, how could we accommodate, in a transactional sense, perhaps greater investment and influencing Greenland, maybe reassessing the fees that are charged on the over the Panama Canal use without actually encroaching on sovereignty. So once again, we need to start thinking in this transactional sense, the art of the deal, but always respecting our core values, including the sanctity of borders, territorial sovereignty, and self-determination.
Excellent. So do we have a question in the room or online for Filippo? We'll certainly give you other chances, but I do want to give you, this is a conversation between us and you, and there are a lot of questions. Are you concerned about the art of the deal as a principle of international law? Yes, right here. And please wait, we've got mics in the room. Please do introduce yourself.
All right, I'm Thiago. I'm from Brazil. I'm an MPP student. Um, I was going to say, like, I completely understand that the art of the deal, it's a deal, it's a transactional approach to the international stage. Um, but don't you think, like, we should maybe analyze as well what a precedent is being established when the when maybe the major Western global superpower is it's coming back to those ages of threatening with a big stick, and and I believe that I don't know, like um, seeing this in the world stage um, once again is in a time where international law is being so disrespected, in even by Western states. And K- isn't it like how concerning is this? Like a rising expansionist speech on a or on the right wing nationalism, not only in the but now in the U.S. as well, with the disrespect for international law that we're seeing nowadays, both in Ukraine and in Palestine.
Mhm. So we have to analyze what we mean by disrespect for international law. Uh, so what's interesting actually about what authoritarian or would-be authoritarian leaders are saying is they're still using the language of international law. So if we look at the Russian invasion, they didn't call it an invasion. They called it a special military operation that was either in self-defense or to protect certain minority groups or to prevent an alleged genocide. They're using the language of international law. Now, the facts don't back up what they're saying, but it's interesting to see that they're not renouncing this system that we've built up over centuries. They're trying to work within it. And that gives me some hope about how, even in a transactional world, that we can still be respecting these principles. Just to give you another example of this transactional attitude that I see, the deal that was just the ceasefire that was just reached on Israel and Gaza, there's been 15 months of negotiations behind the scenes. Suddenly, we have an unlikely coalition of Brett McGurk, President Biden's lead negotiator, Steve Witkoff, President Trump's golf buddy and a real estate investor, and then the Qatari prime minister. Now, it's early days, but we're seeing more progress in terms of the return of hostages, in terms of withdrawal of troops, in terms of a sequence for actually ending this conflict in some way than we've seen for nearly for 15 months. And that was a transactional process that brought together people that we hadn't thought of before. So there's a lot to be concerned about. There's a lot of potential breaches on the horizon, but there's also opportunities to perhaps be more creative than we have been in the past.
Fantastic. So we will come back to Filippo on the question of opportunities, but Tiago raised the issue of actors in the international system, and a significant actor in the international system is China. And so the question of how the new administration in the United States deals with China, I think, is at the forefront of many concerns. And to speak about that, we've got Yeling Tan, who's a professor of public policy here at the Blavatnik School also. Her work focuses on the political economy of globalization, development, and policymaking with a focus on China and the Asian region. She's the author of the prize-winning Disaggregating China Inc. State Strategies in the Liberal Economic Order, published in 2021. So, Yeling, talk us through. We've heard decoupling already. How much of decoupling is real, And what do we expect to happen? Is decoupling going to continue?
Thanks, Pepper. If I could zoom out for a second, and then I'll end up with decoupling. When we look at the US and China over the past 8 years, we see the two countries sinking ever deeper into an economic security dilemma that's really quite dangerous. And I say it's an economic security dilemma because we have one side raising measures to strengthen what it perceives as its own economic security. Those measures then get interpreted by the other side as being a threat, right? And then the other side raises measures to strengthen their economic security. It triggers a reaction, and this escalatory spiral goes back and forth. And the end result is that neither side is more secure. And this is a dynamic that is very difficult to rein back, even with the change in administration in the US, because there are very deeply entrenched narratives on both sides that drive this dynamic, right? In the US, there is a narrative of predation, right? China is engaging in a predatory economic model that is out to destroy American prosperity. On the Chinese side, you see China, in China, a narrative that's also very deeply embedded, which is a narrative of containment, that the US is waging a campaign of all out containment that's seeking to weaken China. And as long as these narratives remain deeply entrenched, right, each side sees the other as a source of insecurity. And that makes the situation quite unstable and difficult to de escalate. As a result, we see from reactions from both sides that are generating more insecurity. So, from the US, right, what have we seen the US doing in response to this narrative of predation? The strategies, I would say, are a little bit all over the place, right? And the Biden administration had the strategy of invest, align, and compete, right? So invest, industrial policy, tariffs against Chinese electric vehicles, align, right? Getting partners and allies around the world to strengthen export controls, and then compete. Again, technology export controls. This then gets interpreted within China as containment. And I would wager that what comes next in the Trump 2.0 administration, it will be a lot more unpredictable, but I don't see perspectives within China shifting away from the overarching narrative, which will remain one of containment. And so how then is China responding to this, what it sees as US-led containment? I would say it's responding in three ways, right? It's defending, it's diversifying, and it's decoupling. So coming back to decoupling. In terms of defending, right, it's retaliating, right? Tit for tat. You tariff me, I tariff you. You impose export controls, I'll find something to impose export controls on. At the same time, China's diversifying. It's strengthening its trade and investment relations with the rest of the world, right? And reducing its amount of direct trade and investment with the United States. And then thirdly, it's seeking to decouple. I would say how much of the decoupling is real, how much of it is not real, it's a spectrum. Some aspects of decoupling were always in place even when relations were stable. Right? I just came back from a trip to Shanghai. And as with many trips to China, what I need to make sure I do before I enter is to make sure I have all my apps, all my Chinese apps, right? Because it's a different ecosystem. The internet and social media and your smartphone apps all operate on a different system. And China has been trying to strengthen some aspects of decoupling in terms of critical technology. The degree to which it can do so, right, to boost its self-reliance and to reduce its vulnerability to external coercion is really up for debate because supply chains remain very entangled. But to see what China is trying to do, I think you could look at what Huawei is doing, right? The technology company Huawei, right? It now on its phones runs a completely different operating system. It calls it the Harmony OS, right? Whereas it used to use Android, now it has invested in an entirely different operating system. So it's trying to push towards that kind of decoupling. But there are many aspects of decoupling that remain, I would say, not so real, right? If we think about tariffs, they are basically shifting supply chains, but have not actually led the two countries to be any less dependent on each other. So it's important to keep that spectrum in mind.
So how do we think about the bargaining that's going on over TikTok in the United States? So for those in the room who don't know, there was a law passed that TikTok needed to have to divest of its Chinese ownership because of the role that it played in the American ecosystem. That didn't happen. TikTok appeared to go dark, and Trump said, no, we're going to do something with executive order to make TikTok stay open, and I'm sure the Chinese will cut a deal with us. Is this another art of the deal where actually we're going to see Trump be a little softer than his rhetoric suggests?
It's hard to say. So if we look at TikTok, it's caught between two regulatory regimes, right? On the one hand, as it operates in the U.S., it has to abide by the Supreme Court ban, which is why it went dark. On the other hand, it's also because its parent company is ByteDance, which is a Chinese company. It's caught within China's own export control regime, which has listed algorithms as one of the core technologies that China refuses to export. Right, so it risks also breaking Chinese law if it abides by the U.S. ruling. What's and Trump's approach to this is interesting because it neither sidesteps this regulatory dilemma and also doesn't address any of the security concerns that drove the ruling in the first place. So I think it could evolve in it would require some very nifty deal making to save TikTok in a way that doesn't lead to regulatory challenges on either side, I would say.
Well, I can think of one person who thinks nifty deal making is now a function of the Oval Office. But what do you think? Questions out there, either online or in the audience, for Yeling on the state of the U.S. relationship with China and what it means for the broader international economic architecture? Yes, sir, right here. Wait for the microphone, please.
Fergus Munro, thank you for that. Where does that leave us with Taiwan and China's designs on Taiwan?
Taiwan, I would say, is another one of those areas of, I would say, more uncertainty compared to the Biden administration. Under the Biden administration, you saw, I think, efforts to really stabilize the relationship. Since being elected, Trump has said that Taiwan, and I'm speaking slowly because I want to try and get this right, Taiwan needs to pay more to the US for the protection that the US has offered it. And that also Taiwan has unfairly robbed America of chip technology, right, of semiconductor technology. So those are not necessarily very friendly messages, right? And so would Taiwan then try and strike a deal? Would Taiwan respond by trying to strike a deal with the US? I hesitate to speculate on such an important issue. On China's side, I would say that China at the moment is very much focused on domestic priorities, right? Apart from this need to struggle against what the Chinese government calls a US-led campaign of containment. So the self-reliance drive that I spoke about earlier, its domestic economy is extremely weak at the moment. And so what you see coming out from the Politburo the political bureau, the leadership is that the domestic economy is very much high on the agenda. At the same time, on the military side, there have been a number of very high-level purges, which would lead one to think that probably China would not be in a very good state to want to escalate the situation in Taiwan, at least for the time being.
So before we move on to have Christoph talk to us about the broader scene on tariffs, I wonder if you could tell us, Yeling, because you talked about the Politburo, but isn't it really Xi Jinping that we're talking about at this point? And to what extent do we know what his mental map is of economic relations and Chinese power in the global order more broadly?
Economic relations with the rest of the world?
Yes.
Well, I think we can also look at what his executive vice premier, Ding Xuexiang, has been projecting to Davos, which is ongoing at the moment. And as you say, the messages are very much unified, right? Because the current Xi Jinping Politburo is basically, and the Politburo Standing Committee is staffed with Xi loyalists. And the message I would say to the rest of the world is that China's door is open. It's seeking friendly relations with the rest of the world. It's seeking more foreign investments to go into the country. And it's seeking a broadly cooperative mode rather than a confrontational mode with the US. So you don't see China trying to escalate, right? I think you see China trying to stabilize the situation with the US as far as it can, right? And since Trump has been sworn in, the US has not explicitly named a number when it comes to tariffs, right? Rather, it's called for a review of their phase one agreement, and so it opens the door for the two sides to talk a little bit. Whether or not this message in terms of open economic relations with the rest of the world actually lands, I think is a separate question altogether, because foreign investors are quite wary of investing within China at the moment. And we can get into those questions later if there's interest.
So I've got a question online that I wanted to pass on to you from Hugh Roberts. Containment was the motive for Japan to attack the U.S. at Pearl Harbor in 1941. Why should the reaction from China be different if the containment is allowed to continue, e.g. to invade Taiwan on the basis of breaking out of containment where their military advantage would be likely to be strongest?
I think China and Japan are quite different. If you look at China's approach to self-reliance, part of that, a big proportion of that has to do with strengthening its domestic market, increasing domestic demand, and trying to reshore supply chains within China. China is just a much larger country compared to Japan. And then it's at the same time using trade and investment agreements to try to secure access to what it sees as critical inputs, and that comes from the rest of the world. So I think the key difference is that the world is much more globalized compared to before. We have a China that's enmeshed in the global economy and that has become economically successful as a result of the overarching economic stability that was created in the post-war era. So I don't think China sees it in its own interest to disrupt many of the multilateral institutions that it has that it sees as being beneficial to its own economic rise.
Okay, that's a perfect segue for us to move to Christoph on tariffs in the international system, because U.S. international commitments have been falling left and right today with the new executive orders. So nobody better to talk to us about this than Christoph. Christoph is the Lester B. Pearson Professor in International Relations in the Department of Politics and International Relations here at Oxford, and a professorial fellow at St. Anne's College. He joined Oxford last year after a decade at McGill University in Canada. and we're delighted to have him. His research unpacks how global rules are made, bent, and broken, which means he will be busy over the next 4 years. So, Christoph, give us the bad news and give us the good news.
Great. So maybe I'll start with the more obvious part, which is the bad news, and then I'll keep the good news in my pocket here, and I'll take it out when needed, when we're in need of it during this conversation. So maybe the most obvious thing is that these kinds of threats, which are really the currency that Trump dabbles in, generate a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty is bad from the firm standpoint, right? It acts as a tax on transactions, a tax on trade. You can actually measure this. Actually, part of my PhD was showing that the threat of a tariff is equivalent to actually imposing that tariff at half the magnitude in terms of its effects on trade. Firms get skittish. And when you see that kind of uncertainty, things go awry. You have all sorts of funny feedback effects, including effects that in this case would go against the desires of the Trump administration. So what's happening right now, all users of imports in the United States are massively importing everything they can as fast as possible and stockpiling, right? That is tremendously inefficient. And by the way, it goes against the desire of the Trump administration to reduce trade deficits, right? And so we saw that kind of stockpiling of steel and aluminum in the first round of tariffs during the first Trump administration, and we're seeing it again. The point is that supply chains, along the lines of what Yelling was saying, are very good at adapting. But that's very hard to do when you don't know what you're adapting to. And so uncertainty is a huge cost, and it's not necessarily, despite being, I think, a part of the art of the deal, what Trump might have in mind. The other piece of bad news is that I don't think this can be merely US versus everyone else, right? So you might imagine that, well, after all, this is the US imposing these tariffs, so everyone might have to retaliate against the US, but we're going to see continued trade cooperation elsewhere. And the problem here is that you're going to see a lot of trade diversion, right? So the US imports a lot. If it increases tariffs, all that stuff, think massively imports from China, has to go somewhere, right? And so we saw that during the glut of steel in the first Trump administration. And where's that going to go? It's going to go everywhere else, including the UK. And so countries like the UK need to anticipate the fact that they're going to be facing increased import pressure that they need to think in advance what they're going to do with, right? And one way to do it is simply to accept it. After all, this is going to be low-cost steel, for instance, or not. You have to anticipate the domestic effects that it's going to have, the disruption that it's going to have on domestic economies. And so historically, what we've seen is that when a hegemon like the United States imposes tariffs at this kind of a scale, no one is left out of it, right? So tariffs go up, not just in retaliation, but among all the other parties as well. You have reduced trade cooperation. And in part, it's kind of a zeitgeisty thing, right? So we saw this kind of contagion across US administrations. The Biden administration kept most of, if not all, of the Trump tariffs in place. And so it's just the mood changes, right? The mood changes away from cooperation. But in part, it's precisely because of that trade diversion effect. It's just hard to avoid. And so in the 1930s, following the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, imposed by the US Congress for no good reason, what you saw is massive retaliation against the US, but unfortunately also reduced cooperation elsewhere in the world. And maybe the last point, and this gets to Philippa's question, or Philippa's point about the art of the deal and how this is now the game being played. This is what hegemons do, right? When they change the way that they play, they impose the nature of that game on everyone else. And in this case, that game is a very ugly one, and it's a very costly one for everyone involved. It's a game of tit for tat. So everyone's going to be forced to respond in kind, as reluctantly as they will have to do so, because that's the nature of the game. Yes, it's going to be transactional, and it's going to be retaliatory in this kind of tit-for-tat fashion. And retaliation is costly for those who impose it, especially for small countries like my native Canada.
So I have a question online from Clara Leopard. This is a frightening time for many of us, particularly those of us without expertise in politics or international relations. What is the role of hope as we enter this turbulent chapter of history, and how do you balance hope with reality and pragmatism in your field? What advice do you have for members of the general public who may be feeling despair about the U.S.'s new leadership?
So I have that good news in my pocket, but I'll keep it for now. I guess hope comes from looking at history, right? We've seen these kinds of events before. Nixon imposed,
Like Smoot-Hawley, and then we got the Great Depression. And
yeah, right. I was hoping you'd go for a different analogy. I was going to go for Nixon and a 10% across the board tariff, which is actually closer to what we're seeing here, because what Trump is talking about is a 25% across the board tariff. The across the board part is madness, right? That's the tariffs are usually kind of a customizable instrument, but in this case, it's closer to the Nixon shock, which well, had maybe less effects than we might have thought. Indeed, Smoot-Hawley aggravated the Great Depression and indirectly led to World War II. So history provides maybe sobering lessons in that sense. But if you look at recent years, right, we had COVID, we've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine should have led to a massive food crisis. It didn't, because supply chains adjusted very rapidly. Right? We are, to Yelling's point, at a level of integration such that the system is actually quite nimble. I'm talking about cost, on transactions and uncertainty and so on. But the fact of the matter is that this is a very dense network, and there are many routes to use. And so we've seen massive shocks in the last years, and again, COVID being one of them. And well, the global economy has actually responded remarkably well to those. So I think, looking at history, you can draw the pessimistic lessons, but also, especially in recent years, I think there are some signs for hope in that sense. Resilience.
Okay, so we could use some good news about it now.
All right. So the first item of good news is that we're in Britain. We're not in Canada. And I say this as someone who moved from Canada 15 months ago. And my greater point here is that exposure to the Trump administration's threats is going to vary tremendously by country, right? And a country like Britain has a very different profile from a country like Canada. First of all, Canada sends 80% of its exports to the US. The exposure of Britain is about 15%. It's less than the EU, which is about 20%. Secondly, most of those, so 56% of those exports are services. Services are pretty immune to tariffs. And there's these kinds of funny terms of trade effects, which mean that if you put barriers on goods, which is much easier to do with tariffs, you will increase the trade deficit on services. In other words, there's going to be increased demand for services of the like that Britain exports. Right? So Britain is in a funny way in as good a position as it might be in terms of its trade profile. The second part, and I've mentioned this, tariffs are a very old school instrument, right? So Trump likes to call himself the tariff man. Tariffs are like from the 19th century. We were much beyond tariffs in terms of trade relations and trade policy and statecrafts. What was the name of the game until around 2016 was regulation, was creating regulation that correlates with national advantage. A firm would turn to a trade lawyer and say, this is what we do well. Could you craft some kind of instrument for us? And lawyers would lobby for creating a health standard that allows that advantage to shine. Right? And that is much more nuanced, it's much more opaque, and it's much harder to address, to tackle. Tariffs are blunt and they're very transparent. And the costs of them are very plain to see. And US consumers are going to suffer. And they're going to be able to see that they're suffering because what they got is a 25% tax on consumption, right? And especially if it's across the board tariff, well, there's going to have a lot of undesirable effects. So that's good news insofar as there's going to be a lot of feedback, a lot of pushback against these policies. Now, it's bad news.
And your idea is good news is the upset American public's going to have further calls for upset.
Well, the upset American public in a situation where Trump doesn't like people or his base especially disliking him, right? And so what this is going to hurt is consumers, especially poor consumers who shop at Walmart, right? Walmart is going to be massively affected. And it's precisely those cheaper goods that are going to see the brunt of that because those are all being relying on imports. There's a bad news to the good news insofar as 25% across the board tariff means what? It means that all these powerful industries are going to turn for favors to the administration. You're going to see massive corruption going up because they're going to look for exemptions and they're going to get them. Right, so they're going to try and justify why this one thing that is essential here and maybe essential for defense purposes that is not made in the U.S. needs an exemption, and they're going to use national security or anything that will sway the Trump administration. And what that means essentially is corruption of the kind that the Trump administration will be very good at exploiting. Maybe the last point here on the good news is that, and this goes against what I said in the bad news, we are seeing pushback. We are seeing pushback in terms of some attempts at countervailing trade cooperation elsewhere in the world. And so the EU just signed a deal that has been well over a decade in the making with Mercosur, Latin American countries, which is the biggest trade deal that the EU has. The EU has been at the forefront of all sorts of quite creative initiatives to get around blocks created by the US, including at the World Trade Organization and its adjudicatory function. And so there's an increase in terms of creativity to get around the US barriers. So, and maybe the last example, because it concerns the UK, in 1932, following Smoot-Hawley tariff by the US, there's something called the Ottawa Conference, where the UK creates a system of imperial preferences. Imperial preferences were low tariffs within essentially Commonwealth countries and higher external tariffs. But it created a trading bloc that was a cooperating trading bloc. And nothing stops the EU, for instance, from trying to create that kind of trading bloc against the US. And we're seeing some early signs of that.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've done I will come back to you, ma'am. We've done exactly what policymakers have done in one country after another. We've talked about international relations. We've talked about the economy. We've talked about international law. And meanwhile, last year, the temperature rose 1.5 degrees is over the sort of pre-industrial levels, and we've ignored the climate. And so we've got no one better to talk about this and rectify our errors than Professor Tom Hale, who's a professor in public policy here at the Blavatnik School. And he's the co-leads the Net Zero Regulation and Policy Hub, and his most recent book, importantly, is Long Problems, Climate Change, and the Challenge of Governing Across Time. So, Tom, we've all been watching the Los Angeles fires. We've just seen Trump sign an executive order, I believe, to pull the United States out of the Paris Agreement. What's the hope?
So, Pepper, that cognitive dissonance between watching a city, there's no more cinematic city in the world, burn before our eyes, and Trump actually mentioned it during his inaugural remarks yesterday, as well as the recent hurricanes in North Carolina and other parts of the American South, and then seeing the executive orders that are going exactly the opposite direction. So that cognitive dissonance was in the inaugural speech. There are four primary pillars for climate action in the United States. I just want to say a word about each one so we can assess what this all means for both the United States and its climate efforts, but also what that means for the world as a whole. So the first pillar is executive regulation, executive orders like the one signed yesterday, and rulemaking by agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency. And this has been a kind of trench warfare between the Republican and Democratic administrations over recent memory. So Clinton put in some climate change measures through the EPA, Bush rolled them out. Obama put them back in, Trump rolled them out. Biden put them back in, and now yesterday Trump has yet again undone these measures on things like power plant standards, fuel efficiency standards for cars, how federal lands and waters can be used for exploiting what kinds of resources. And because of this back and forth, there is no more litigious area of American climate policy than these kinds of rules. So one administration does something, and then immediately it takes years to work through the courts. The change, though, is that during Trump's first term, he was able to appoint 3 justices to the United States Supreme Court. And those justices were instrumental in a ruling last year, in a famous case that overturns an important precedent for this kind of executive rulemaking by American agencies in a famous case called Chevron. And that meant that these recent kind of federal rules were already a little bit in question before the election even happened. And so this recent round maybe wasn't really changing people's expectations for how they would be weakened further during the Trump administration. Interestingly, these rules are also able to maybe have a little bit of a silver lining to Christoph's good point. So one of the rules is coming in is going to be making it easier to build energy infrastructure in the United States. Actually, one of the most important things the United States needs to do to achieve its climate goals is to build more energy infrastructure, particularly grid connectivity, which is what renewables desperately need. And so there might be some silver linings there. Also new rules on critical minerals. So that one's a little bit of it's been back and forth for a while, and now definitely going to the anti-climate side of things. But that's probably the case anyway, and there might be a few silver linings, small though they might be. The second main pillar, though, is big pot of money called the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a huge outcome of the Biden administration, $1 trillion in basically giveaways to clean energy and much, much, much else, including to oil and gas companies for things like carbon capture and storage technology or other sorts of things they've long wanted. So this is a policy that was designed explicitly with a future Republican administration in mind. And the political theory behind this kind of policymaking of having carrots, not sticks, is that pork breeds resilience. In other words, giveaways are very hard to take back once they've been given. And indeed, it's not without planning that most of the benefits of this act have flowed into Republican districts. Of the 20 top clean energy districts in the United States, 19 of them have a Republican member of Congress. And indeed, 18 of those Republican members of Congress sent a letter to the leader of the Congress, leader of the House, Mike Johnson, in August saying, please don't get rid of these energy tax credits because we really like them. Now, the Republicans' current majority in the House of Representatives is 2. They have 2 more people than they need to get to 2018, which is a majority. And so in that context, it's very hard to see much of this changing. The dominant tendency is probably inertia. The caveat to that is in a world of razor-thin margins, you have some very lower probability but very high potential outcomes where you could get some sort of log rolling deal making that goes really quickly because of, say, a budget deadline or a kind of debt ceiling deadline, and then you get some pretty extreme outcomes. Indeed, that's how we have the Inflation Reduction Act in the first place, because of that sort of quite crazy, chaotic chaos in the House. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of the Inflation Reduction Act, but there's some pretty strong structural forces to suggest continuity. The downside of that, though, is that a lot of this law, which is huge, requires executive agencies under the control of the Trump administration to implement them. So one of the things Trump said he would do is to remove the electric vehicle tax credit, $7,500 you get for buying an electric car in the United States. He can't do that, actually, because that's legislative. It would have to take an act of Congress. But what he can do, what the administration can do, is define the terms and conditions under which you can access that. So how much of it has to be built in the United States, for example, how much has to go for this kind of car, that kind of car. So lots of ways, and that's just an example of the many provisions of this law that require executive action to execute them. The third pillar of U.S. climate action is everything that happens outside the District of Columbia, outside of Washington, right? And actually, the United States is a very federal country, and there's tons of climate policy that's actually much more importantly controlled by states and cities than by the federal government. So you'll remember after Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement the first time in 2017, he said in his speech, I was elected to represent the people of Pittsburgh, not the people of Paris. And at that point, the mayor of Pittsburgh, who actually was represented to elect these people, said, no, we're going to stay in the Paris Agreement. We are still in. And that led to a big movement of U.S. states and cities and businesses and investors and tribes and all sorts of non-federal actors to form this big coalition. That coalition is now called We Are All In, following the Biden administration's going back into the Paris Agreement. And that speaks for something like 60% of the U.S. economy. And they have already said very clearly that they intend to remain the course. And so that's obviously not 100% of the U.S. economy. And there's a lot of things, especially that huge boost in the Inflation Reduction Act, that we're going to supercharge all that action. But it's definitely not 100% out either. The final piece, and I think one of the most grim ones, is on international cooperation. Obviously, the United States will now withdraw from the Paris Agreement. It hasn't actually, I think, filed it with the UN yet, so it still will take 12 months, as Philippa was saying, for that to take effect. But that's something that's going to happen. And here I think there's one really damaging thing, which is finance for especially countries that can't give themselves a $1 trillion pot of money. So the United States had about $3 billion of climate finance obligations. That's not going to be forthcoming. But more importantly, it's a big donor and shareholder in the multilateral development banks like the World Bank and others that are the biggest source of climate finance, especially to countries that need it most. And that will be the biggest uncertainty, I think, for global climate diplomacy, whether that mobilization of capital through international financial institutions can continue at the pace and scale it needs to continue. So it's a pretty mixed picture across those 4 pillars. You see certainly an end to the federal regulations, but we kind of had that dynamic for a long time anyway, and the Chevron outcome made it less clear. Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of
Say 2 words about the Chevron decision.
So the Chevron decision was from a famous case where basically the court was asked, does the EPA have authority to regulate companies, for example, on pollution standards in that case, through its rulemaking powers, kind of filling in the dots that were not filled in by Congress. And the court has, from the 1970s forward, said, yes, that's an important function for executive agencies to do in pollution, in health, in all sorts of areas where not every rule is made by Congress, but actually implemented by those. And Chevron was a key underpinning of that case, of that whole body of regulatory action, and the court struck it down. But so this to sum up, I think the overall outcome is quite unclear. And the final thing to say is, the 2 things were true before Trump was elected and will remain true after, I think. The first is that the world as a whole is on a very clear energy transition. We're adding more renewable energy than we ever have done in the past. It's extremely cost effective. It's by far the most attractive source of energy for many, many applications in the United States and outside of it. And that's not going to change. It will slow down, but it's in the United States, but it's not going to change. And 2, the United States specifically has been having an oil and gas revolution because of fracking since the Obama administration. That was true during both terms of Obama and during Trump 1 and during Biden. And today, when the United States is not in an energy crisis, as Trump said yesterday, but actually is in a golden age of energy bequeathed to him by the Biden administration, where it's performing way more energy than it needs at home, is exporting it around the world. And for the climate, that's not good news, but that's not something that Trump is going to be able to change in a substantial way. So I think more continuity than change.
Okay, let me open the floor now. I've got some questions online. Yes, ma'am, you were up. Wait, can you wait to get the microphone and introduce yourself?
Hi, my question is for Christoph. I'm from Mexico, so the tariffs really affect us. And I work with some companies that depend totally on the exports to the US. Mexico, 80% of our exports go to the US, so we are really worried about the tariffs. So my question is, you really think that they will put the 25% to the export? Because in the last term of Trump, he said exactly the same. And then he made us stop the migration to the US and he take off the tariffs. So this is really a threat, or you think he's going to make it? Because yesterday we thought that he was going to put that in the executive orders, but he didn't. But he said he will put it on February 1st. So actually, we don't know if this is a threat or if he will actually do it, or that he make us do something else to he take off the tariffs.
Well, the obvious answer is we don't know, and that's the point, right? So we don't know by design. The point is precisely to sow this uncertainty and to start extracting from it. And so, indeed, we've seen this before. We saw it with the prior administration, the prior Trump administration, where Trump threatened multiple times to abrogate NAFTA and then, renegotiate, I would say, along pretty conservative lines. And so, what are the odds that a 25% tariff on the entire world goes across? Probably pretty low. But the point is this: threatening it by itself, when it's done by the president of the United States, has effects on trade, right? Trade flows are affected very negatively. And so even if it's not delivered on, it still has negative effects. And of course, it has, negative effects insofar as it pushes towards, back to Philippa's transactional point, it pushes towards this kind of costly bargaining where, Costa Rica needs to now pony up something in order to prevent this from happening. And this is by design. but it's costly, again, probably for all parties concerned.
I've got a question online from Hugh Roberts for Tom. If the U.S. withdraws from all or most climate control legislation, is there any point in the rest of the world respecting them either? For example, has anyone modeled what will happen to world temperatures if the U.S. is pumping gas and oil again without internationally agreed restrictions?
It's a great question. And I think at the heart of it is a assumption around, do countries make climate policy because they see what other countries do, are following them or not following them, or are they doing it for other reasons? And I've long argued, and I think the body of consensus now is that the idea that countries only act because others are acting is just fundamentally not true. It might be partly true, particularly for certain cases where there's a strict economic competition example, but it's probably not true on average. It's particularly not true for the biggest countries in the world that have the most impact on the climate: the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils, the Indonesias, and others like that. Climate is really driven mostly by electoral outcomes domestically, whether the party in power has a interest in promoting clean energy or not. And that's not that affected by what other countries do all the time. Other things that matter are increasingly who is going to succeed in gaining this new economic opportunity that these new technologies offer. China this year has had more than half the cars sold in China last year are new energy vehicles. That was the Biden administration's target for 2030. This year it's about 8 or 9% in the US. And so if Trump is going to slow that down, he's got to tell Chrysler and Ford and General Motors and all of them why the United States is not going to be leading this new industry. Right? So there's a lot of reasons that are domestic about political economy that are shaping that outcome as opposed to the international one. Like I said, where it matters most is where international financial flows are the thing that countries really need, and that doesn't matter so much for the Chinas and Indias and Indonesias of the world. Of course, they like that and would like to talk about it, but it's more for how do we protect those that are most vulnerable. And if you think about what the American people's long-term interest is, not building resilience into these kinds of security crises potentially could emerge from a warming planet, as we see already happening around the world, is potentially a really big long-term cost. So I think there's a lot of short-termism in this, but also I'm not so worried that other countries are going to follow Trump out of the Paris Agreement. They can join the other three: Yemen, Libya, and Iran.
Very good. So we've got a provocative question online from Russell Smith, which I'm going to send to Ye Ling, though anyone is welcome to answer it, because Ye Ling is a political economist, and she's used to thinking about these sort of forms of government and their rule over the economy. Isn't using the term Trump administration, quote unquote, and treating it in the same way as previous U.S. administrations an example of political gaslighting, given that Trump is reconfiguring the administration to be run and staffed by abject loyalists to Trump alone, without any expertise or experience whatsoever of doing the jobs allocated to them? And one could add that the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, has been put in charge of the project of governmental effectiveness, with which he has no previous experience. Ye Ling, thoughts?
Should we use a different term and not Trump administration?
Yeah, well, I think that's an entree into the question, at least.
I mean, we've been here before, right? We were here in 2016, and I think amongst political economists, institutionalists, lawyers, what was astonishing in terms of lessons learned was that institutions work not so much through brute force enforcement of laws as they sit in paper, but through self-restraint, right? Through abiding by norms, rather than pushing the norms until they break. And so I think this lesson applies to regime types, whether they're democracies or autocracies, right? Some autocracies seem well run, some do not. Some democracies seem well run, and some do not. And so I think when we look at Trump 2.0, how much continuity will there be from Trump 1.0 in terms of norm breaking and the lack of self-restraint? I think that will continue, and probably to an extent that is more unrestrained, right? Because of the margin of victory that we saw in the election this time round.
Would you consider big or small?
I think it was decisive and higher. right? Rather than disputed, which a lot of people were.
Yes. Okay. Nevertheless, one of the smallest margins of victory, but nevertheless, it was a victory. I think that question raises an important point about whether or not everyone who works for Trump is Trump's lackey, or whether there are, in fact, really competing ideological threads inside of the administration. And to schematize very crudely, one could think about the tech bros who were in the first row yesterday, where you saw Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Bezos sitting next to each other ahead of the cabinet, right? The people supposedly actually working for Trump. And so the tech bros seem strong. On the other side is the MAGA movement, the red hat guys, not led by, but certainly cheered on by former Trump loyalist Steve Bannon. And so this is a real ideological cleavage at the heart of the administration. So I'd like the panel to think about, in their area, how that kind of tension is likely to play out, and what we might look for to know who the real Donald Trump is. Tom, I'd like to start with you.
So I think it's a little bit of a different cleavage in the climate realm, where, in 2016, this big "we are still in" moment I was mentioning, corporates were very much part of that in 2016, and particularly two sectors, finance and tech. And finance and tech are the two parts of corporate America that moved most decisively toward Trump this time around, right? So this is a very interesting change in sort of the climate alignment of interest groups. But by far, the biggest group in the room beyond those two, you mentioned, Pepper, is the oil and gas industry, which was all in on Trump and is now ready to receive the benefits of that investment. And so I think this is a very interesting evolution in the long political economy of climate in the United States, where it's increasingly the case that the future of oil and gas depends on political support. So they're really in this existential battle for the value of their assets and therefore their political power with new forms of energy. And they're some of them are going down that path, but they want to control the pace at least. And so they see political power as the best way to secure that in a way that's never been true before. And so they kind of have to win in this way, or else they're toast. And that's quite a different sort of existential threat that they bring to it. So amongst your two groups, I put that as a third category, which is has this an orthogonal interest.
Interesting. Philippa, we just saw everyone who stormed the Capitol pardoned. And we had a question earlier, which I didn't make vocal from someone. Does this sort of lack of legal observance by some in the Trump movement, does that herald an undermining of international law in the U.S.? Or do the tech bros have a real interest in maintaining, again, international law so they can sell goods?
Well, Biden also 10 minutes before he finished his presidency pardoned his family. Not everything is Trump versus the rest of us. I think there's disappointing behavior on all sides. But certainly behavior that flouts constitutional norms does create concern and uncertainty. And it was interesting to hear Christoph talk about the fact that you see concrete results from mere threats rather than the actual implementation. I think we're going to see a lot of that during the Trump administration, like we saw it the first time round. But I think where people like the oligarchs, the tech bros are going to perhaps have a more moderating influence is they don't want the chaos agency that Steve Bannon promotes. They don't want their platforms being associated with misinformation. They do want some...
That why Mark Zuckerberg's fact-checking away.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how that plays out. And that was an interesting development, and the Oversight Committee's reaction to that. But ultimately, they still want to be part of the conversation. They want to be a news source. They want to be relied upon. And if they go too far in the other direction, then the truth social direction, which never really got traction with the population, then that's not going to be to their interest. So I think their moderating influence potentially is that when it comes to AI, they want some kind of ground rules, obviously less than what the EU or the UK would want, but something, not a complete free-for-all, because that's actually going to help their competition with China. They're going to want some reliability for the platforms that they use, and they also want to be able to invest in various industries and in various potential applications without thinking, oh, there's going to be an executive order the next day that turns it around. So that it's very easy to pass an executive order in a number of areas for the US, but there's other involvements of the US, and this goes to Tom's point about continuity, where it's not subject to executive order. So NATO, for example, it's actually a very complex process for the US to withdraw from NATO. So I think, one of the signs we might be looking for is, are we just seeing a lot of bluster? Are we seeing a few executive orders being passed, although some of them with some serious effects? Or are we going to see this kind of systematic dismantling of the international legal order that actually takes real effort, time, precision, and detail? And I'm moderately hopeful that we're not going to see that latter strategy.
So we're almost out of time. So you've each got 30 seconds to tell us who is the real Trump on tariffs and on China. Christoph, you first.
Well, so on tariffs, maybe the one thing to say is that even the goals behind tariffs are conflicting here. And so there are many personas of Trump on this. On the one hand, Trump says this is all against China and we want to block tariffs, block goods from China to protect domestic manufacturing. On the other hand, you've heard him at least as often say, we're going to raise a lot of revenue, right? Like in the 19th century. Well, guess what? You can't do both, right? If you block all imports, then you're not raising revenue by definition. And along the same lines, there's a bit of a clash within the administration in terms of trade in dollars, right? So is a strong dollar good or is it bad? The Wall Street types, including the Commerce and Treasury Secretary, are from Wall Street, and Wall Street usually thinks of a strong dollar as being a good thing. Main Street and J.D. Vance think that the strong dollar is costing U.S. manufacturing exports. And so you're going to see a clash there too. And so what we're going to see is, maybe a watering down of the decisiveness and the bluster that we're seeing early on.
Great. Yeling, you get the final word.
So in China, there are no dubs. I think the mainstream position in Washington, D.C. is to be a China hawk. There's been some speculation on whether or not Elon Musk could be some kind of Henry Kissinger-esque figure, given that given Tesla's investments in China. But if you look at Musk's overall portfolio, Tesla is just a rather small proportion of his larger investments. So there are no doves, there are only hawks. The issue is that there are different kinds of hawks, right? There are trade hawks and there are security hawks, and they want different things out of China, right? The trade hawks are focused on that trade deficit, and they want to rectify that trade deficit. The security hawks want a much broader and deeper rectification of the relationship with China. So it's there. As a result, there is no clear China strategy, I would say.
Well, I've got to stop us there, at least for my online crowd. But the good news is there are drinks out in the forum, and we can continue the conversation for all of those that I did not get to bring in. But please join me in thanking the panelists for this extreme conversation.